Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for tuning in with us today. I'm Patricia Capella, the Conference Manager for Clarion UX Food and Beverage Trade Shows, which produces several industry events and conferences. During these uncertain times, we are doing everything we can to keep our industry up to date with as many resources and education we can offer. Our industry is getting hit hard, and we do hope that our webinar today, as well as our previous ones and more to come, will help. With us today is Dale Willerton, the Lease Coach. He will be providing us some important information regarding rent assistance for food service tenants during COVID-19. We are going to do things a bit differently today, and I will ask Dale a series of questions that he will answer, our top 10. Please know that all audience members are on listen-only mode, which means that you are muted. We will be monitoring the audience engagement on the dashboard and do encourage you to ask questions. We will be taking a Q&A at the end, so your questions will be answered. So, Dale, thank you again for joining us today and sharing your expertise with our audience. And before we get started with our top 10, would you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Thank you, Patricia. I've been looking forward to this webinar all morning, and I'm ready. We've got a lot of great content for the listeners. Some of them are still joining in. So we'll do a brief introduction. You know, it's really important that if you're taking advice, any kind of advice, that you know who you're getting the advice from. Prior to 1993, I used to be a shopping center manager. I was a leasing rep working for Landlords, and I learned a lot of the tricks of the trade on the landlord side of the desk. But 27 years ago, I realized I was on the wrong team. I wanted to work for the tenant. So I became the lease coach. And one thing led to another. I started doing seminars. I started writing books. We now have 8 offices in North America, and we serve tenants from coast to coast. And I speak at a lot of the restaurant shows. So it's really a pleasure for me to come and share some of this content. This is my third webinar in just a couple of days. So this topic is very, very timely, and I'm ready to get started.
Okay, great. If we want to just click to the next slide, I know that was showing what who's been with you. So let's start on with the first question. In your book, Negotiating Commercial Leases and Renewals for Dummies, you state that there are many different types of landlords. Can you explain that?
Yes, it's very important to understand who your opponent is. Now, as a society, we go out shopping at shopping malls, and, those are great big institutional kind of landlords. There's really no person that calls themselves the landlord, these big mall landlords. We have developers. I used to work for a developer. They would buy a piece of land, they would design a property, they would pre-lease it, and then a couple of years later, they would sell it or flip it for a profit, and there was nothing wrong with that. But sometimes the tenant doesn't have the same landlord they started with. There are banks that own properties, insurance companies that own properties, REITs, real estate investment trusts. So there, a lot of different landlords. I was talking to a tenant this morning. His landlord was a mom and pop landlord. So it was a small plaza. There was half a dozen tenants, and the owner of the plaza had a business right inside. So these landlords, Patricia, have different motivations for owning these properties, and they have different depths to their finances. Okay, some landlords are in a better position to help tenants than others, and some aren't. Many of them have mortgages on their properties, and they're facing some of the same obstacles as tenants. But if you don't know who your landlord is and how deep their pockets are, you're not going to have a very successful negotiation with them.
Got it. So, switching to our next question, will landlords help their restaurant tenants by providing rent assistance during this pandemic, pending recession? Does a tenant simply ask for help?
Well, the landlords are stepping up and helping tenants, but I want the listeners to realize that this is the first time the tenant is going through this situation, and it's the first time for the landlord. This is pretty much unprecedented. I saw 9/11 and the 2008 recession and all kinds of things, but even for landlords, they're stumbling a little bit. And remember, you may have 1 or 2 landlords if you've got 1 or 2 restaurants, but the landlord may have hundreds or thousands of tenants, and they are overwhelmed. So yes, they are making plans to help tenants, but it's not as simply as just asking them for help. The way that you approach a tenant is so important, and I'm not sure if one of our questions deals with the communication stream or not, but how that's supposed to be done. A lot of tenants are taking the wrong approach with their landlord. They're not communicating in a way that the landlord responds very well to.
Okay, great. Thank you. What is the difference between rent relief, rent deferrals, and rent abatement? Are these all forms of rent assistance?
They are all forms of rent assistance. However, they are different as night and day. Tenants, unfortunately, don't always understand the industry jargon, and a tenant might be thinking that the landlord's going to forgive their rent, and the landlord is just planning to defer it to 6 months or 2 years down the road. So let's be really clear. This is really important. Rent relief or a rent deferral means the tenant still owes the money. The landlord keeps it on their books as a receivable, but the repayment date is pushed months or years or to the end of the term down the road. So a deferral or rent relief is better than nothing, but you're really only shifting the problem to another date. Rent abatement is what we go for at the Lease Coach. A rent abatement is 100% forgiven. The tenant does not have to pay it back, and it's important to understand that these two things will be documented different. We're going to talk a little bit about how this is documented later on, but listen to the words your landlord or property manager is using. If they're saying rent relief, you want to start talking to them about rent abatement. There are a few landlords out there doing combinations. So they'll defer some of the rent and they'll abate some of the rent. It's kind of a package deal, but the words count. Understand them.
Thank you. Tomorrow is April 1st, the beginning of a new month, and rent is due. What options do tenants have when the first of the month rolls around and the landlord has not agreed to anything yet?
It's interesting. I've sort of been waiting for today, March 31st, because I'm getting more phone calls today from past clients and existing clients and tenants in general, because their rent is supposed to be due tomorrow. Now, the vast majority of tenants who I'm talking to over this past 10 days or so are saying they're not going to pay any rent at all. And so that is one of their options. You don't have to pay your rent if you don't want to. I mean, you may be putting yourself in a default position, but you're not going to get anything back. If you pay the landlord a bunch of rent money today, and then he comes up with a rent assistance plan a week from now, you're not going to get a rebate. You're not going to get any money back. So most tenants are simply not paying rent. It's a different story across the country because one of my restaurant clients in California, they were mandated by the government to close on March the 16th. In some states, some of the restaurants are still open. Some are doing drive-through, some are doing takeout, some still have some business going on. So some are maybe capable of paying part of their rent. But definitely the communication with the landlord, if you're not going to pay your rent tomorrow, you need to communicate with your property manager about that today or tomorrow at the latest. Don't make them chase you. When I used to be a shopping center manager, one of my primary jobs was rent collection. And so when tenants didn't pay their rent and a few tenants would not pay their rent and they'd phone me up and say, look, I need another week, I need another 10 days, and that would be fine. But the tenants that made me chase them for the rent were the ones that ended up getting in trouble. So you have to handle this situation. Don't go silent. Communicate, and some tenants, Patricia, are even saying, well, look, I'll pay you a week's worth of rent. I can't pay you the whole month, but I'll pay you week by week. I'll start paying weekly instead of monthly. There are different scenarios that you can approach your landlord about.
Okay, and thank you, Dale. Before we go on to our next question, there's a couple of questions that just came in around this. Someone had asked, they have reached out to their landlord already via email, but they haven't gotten a response yet. What do you say to them, or what should they be doing?
Well, that's quite common. And, I use email, Patricia, to keep score. I don't negotiate by email. My primary means of communication is not email. You need to call the property manager. This is probably coming back to a landlord or property manager who's overwhelmed. They've got so many tenants reaching out to them, they just don't have time to respond. So it's not that this tenant may not be necessarily, they're not deliberately ignoring this tenant. They just don't have enough hours in a day to call everybody back. So Try more than once. Don't be personally offended. Try to, if you're phoning an office, like I was talking to a landlord this morning, and he said, well, because we were going to send over some lease documents that were being signed by my client today. And he said, well, nobody's at the office. We're all working at home. Well, there's another scenario, right? So, just keep trying. Just because they don't respond doesn't mean they've said no.
Okay. So essentially just kind of sit tight and just keep trying.
Yeah, you really do have to, like, it doesn't, and if you don't leave a message, this is something that the odd person will call and say, well, you didn't call me back. And I'll say, well, you never left a message. I didn't know you called. You know what I mean? Not everybody is really good at leaving messages. Sometimes they mix up their phone number, and I try calling them back and it doesn't work, but I got the phone number right. They said it wrong. So you've got to try more than once. Remember that the tenant has a responsibility here to make the best effort too.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Moving on to our next question, dollar-wise or percentage-wise, how much rent assistance or reduction should a restaurant tenant aim to get?
100%. If your restaurant is closed, you want a 100% rent abatement. 50% is nice, 75% is better, but we shoot for 100%. Put it this way, if I'm working for a tenant and I ask for a 50% rent break, they never say, why don't you take 75? They never offer you more. So you've got to ask for the absolute maximum. You've got to go for the maximum. And just because your drive-through is open or you've got a little bit of takeout going doesn't mean there's really enough money there to, grease the rent wheels. Don't let that hang you up. You want to go for as much, as high a percentage of rent abatement as you can. And was one of your questions, how many months should you go for as well? Let's see.
No, but I think we should add that question in.
Yeah, that was maybe coming up. The one of the mistakes tenants are making when they're negotiating with their landlord or their property manager is they're going into the negotiation with a cup, and they should be going in with a pail. They should have higher expectations of getting a larger rent reduction package over a longer period of time. This is not going to end in a month. Even if restaurants open, the time it takes to sort of scale up is going to be different for different types of restaurants. So for example, when restaurants are allowed to reopen, I think the fine dining restaurants are going to get a really, really slow resurgence of their customers coming back. Whereas the QSRs and the quick dining places, there's going to be more of that pop in, grab something, take off. It's going to take a period of time for people to get over that fear of being in public. My wife is a good example of this. She is self-isolating like nobody's business. And I'm a little bit more liberal that way, and I'll go out and do a few things if I can. But it's going to be a slow crawl back. So we're aiming, when we're representing a tenant, we're aiming for 6, 12, 18 months of rent assistance ramp. And the amount of rent, so for example, if we get you 100% rent abatement for 4 months, then maybe it'll be a 35% rent abatement for 4 months. Then it'll be a 50% rent abatement. As business is coming back, you can now suddenly start to pay a little bit more money, okay?
All right. And another question we have from our audience here is, will landlords be getting assistance from the federal government, which, if so, enable us tenants for rent concessions?
Well, I'm not really expecting the government to come through with enough that will matter. Remember, we're not just dealing with the pandemic. We're dealing with the pending recession that's going to come after, right? And I think a lot of these assistance programs are more sort of when the pandemic is going on. It'll be up to the landlords and the restaurant tenants to recover on their own. Once they're back open, there's going to be a lot less sympathy for them once they're back open. So here again, you have to look at your type of landlord. Some of these landlords can financially withstand to help their tenants. Others, their mortgages are highly leveraged and they don't have a lot of room either. So there's no one pat answer. Every tenant situation is different, and every every landlord situation is different too.
Thank you, Dale. If we move on to our next question, what is force majeure in a lease?
This is essentially an act of God, a storm like a tornado. It can be a war, and the government comes and takes over certain buildings, and then the tenants have to get out because the government's going to use them. Anything where the parties really have no control over being able to use the property for what it was meant for. And there's a lot of tenants that think this clause is going to save them, and it's not. Here's what a tenant needs to keep in perspective. The force majeure clause was put in there mostly for the landlord's benefit to protect him. But secondly, this is why you don't see tenants lawyering up right now, because you're not going to win this battle 8 months from now in court. If you have to wait 8 months for a rent reduction, you might be out of business tomorrow. So these are all coming down to negotiations. And this clause, the reason I'm putting this up there is that so many tenants think that this is the wheel that's going to drive them to safety. And I'm just saying I don't think it will. And I've had attorneys say they don't think it will. So don't rely on that. Most lease agreements are not filled with loopholes that are going to help the tenant. A landlord will also tell a tenant, check with your insurance provider, because if you happen to be one of those rare tenants that has business interruption insurance, you may be able to make an insurance claim. But business interruption insurance is so expensive, very few tenants actually have it. It's not very common at all. So I wouldn't worry about that.
Okay, thank you. And then if we touch upon, will a landlord treat a franchisee's request for rent assistance any different than an independent restaurant tenant?
Yes, I definitely believe they will. We do a tremendous amount of work in the franchise industry. Franchisees are coming to us all the time, food service ones and non-food service. So first of all, most landlords will prefer a franchise tenant over an independent tenant. There's a franchise system. There's a process. If one franchisee wants to retire, another franchisee will come along and buy the business and keep it running. So there's a lot less turnover when it comes to franchises versus independent. So the landlord will tend to favor a franchise tenant because the landlord believes the franchise tenant will have a greater chance of making it through the pandemic, through the recession, and then back to normal. Okay, so independents are going to fail. Some of the franchise systems are going to succeed. It's really important to understand that the process will be a little bit different as well. When an independent tenant reaches out to a landlord, they will sometimes be required to provide profit and loss statements. Some landlords are sending out information. They want to know your daily sales, your weekly sales. Franchise tenants are typically better at knowing how well their business is doing. Okay, like an independent restaurant owner might call me up and he said, well, I haven't done my profit and loss statement. I'm not sure if I'm making money or losing money. It's just an ongoing thing. The franchise tenant does tend to know that, and so they can show that to the landlord, and the landlord will then, decide if they're going to keep them open. Here's the problem that franchise tenants have. A sophisticated landlord who owns a lot of properties is going to say to the franchise tenant, okay, you come to me, you're looking for a rent abatement or you're looking for some rent assistance, who else is helping you? And the franchise tenant's going to be caught off guard. They're going to go, well, what do you mean? And the landlord's going to say, well, has your franchisor agreed not to collect the royalties? Has your bank agreed that you don't have to pay your business loan this month? Because the landlord's saying they don't want to be the only one helping you. And so franchise tenants are often required to get a letter from their bank or a letter from their franchisor saying those fees and costs and charges are all being abated or put aside as well. Then the landlord will help the tenant. This can be a bit of a battle because not all franchisors are willing to do that. It can drive them, down as well.
Absolutely. And I think we touched upon this maybe a little bit, but can a restaurant tenant suggest the landlord 3 or 4 months of breathing room and to simply add those months on to the end of the lease term?
This is the most common proposal that I'm seeing restaurant tenants make to landlords, but it really doesn't get much traction, and I'll explain why. The average tenant signs a 5-year lease, or let's say 60 months. So what you're doing is you're saying to the landlord, give me 5 months of breathing room, give me 5 months of rent relief, and you can add 5 more months to my term. You can make it a 65-month term. Now, landlords don't like that because the landlord's expectation is that the space will be fully rented and fully leased all the time. So you're really not, the landlord's still going to have a 5-month rent shortfall. That's not what the landlord wants to hear. Most of them will not accept that. If they do accept that, that's a pretty good victory for the tenant, because in most cases, the tenant can still sell their restaurant 2 years from now. The buyer of the restaurant is the one that ends up getting those extra months that are tacked onto the term. But the landlord will be crafty. The landlord will put together in his document that says, if you're ever late on the rent, if you default, if you're not a good tenant, we can reinstate those charges and you're going to have to pay them at some point anyway, or they'll tack it on to some form of personal guarantee. So there's landlords have a lot of ways of tying some conditions into the whole plan, but this is not the plan that's going to work. Most landlords are not going to accept this, and if they do accept it, when they send you the document, it's going to be loaded with a whole bunch of things that you don't like. So.
Okay, thank you, Dale. We have a couple of questions that are coming in, so I'm just going to go to those quickly. The first question here, if the landlord offers 50% initially and my restaurant is closed, can I counter that offer?
Oh, absolutely. And they're probably expecting you to counter offer. Okay, rarely is the landlord's first proposal their final position. Here's kind of my take on this. One of the reasons tenants will sometimes go to the landlord and they'll say, give me a rent break, and I want 50% off my rent next month. And it's a mistake to approach the landlord and ask for what you want, Patricia. What the tenant needs to do is the tenant needs to contact, or what I do for the tenant is contact the landlord and say, Mr. Landlord, Mr. Property Manager, what is your plan? Do you have a plan? Because all these landlords are making plans, okay? So if the landlord comes back and says, well, our plan is to give everybody a 50% rent break, and you want a 75% rent break. Well, now they've already given you 50%. You're only negotiating for the extra 25%, right? So that's how to approach it. You always want to be the batter, not the pitcher, when it comes to a proposal. And so definitely, I think you should negotiate that. Where a lot of tenants come up short when they negotiate their own leases is that they only go 1 or 2 rounds. Think of this like a boxing match. If you go 12 rounds but you actually win, then it was worth it. So tenants just don't have the patience. Part of the problem tenants are having right now is that they've got all these employees that they can't pay, and they're empathetic to these employees. These restaurant owners, Patricia, for the first time in years are sitting on their bum with nothing to do, because the typical restaurant owner works 70, 80 hours a week. They're always in their restaurant, right? They don't know what to do with this leftover time. And so there's a whole bunch of emotions going on here. And I definitely recommend you keep negotiating. As long as you have the rent in your pocket, you have that leverage to negotiate with the landlord. And if they're willing to forgive 50%, maybe you're willing to accept the other 50% as a deferral to a later date. Maybe. It depends on your situation. So I want to make a point here. Some of my tenant clients, some of my restaurant clients are actually quite wealthy. They have the ability financially to weather this storm. They can pay their rent even if their restaurant is closed, but a lot of them can't. Right? Some of my clients are paying $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 a month in rent. Some are paying $2,000 or $3,000 or $4,000 a month in rent. That's why this is such an interesting time I'm more excited getting out of bed in the morning these last couple of weeks than I have been for a while, because I've been the lease coach for 27 years, but this is all new stuff. And it's not always fun, but it's exciting. There's something new happening every day, and every tenant situation is a little bit different.
Yeah. Thanks, Dale. And I like your analogy. So basically, tire your opponent out when you're negotiating.
Absolutely, because you've got to go more than a couple of rounds.
Yes. Another question we have over here. Worst case scenario occurs. We have to close our business. What steps should we address to limit liability?
Okay. I'm going to back up a little bit from that question. Some tenants are making the mistake of approaching their landlord and saying, if you don't give me rent assistance, if you don't waive my rent, if you don't give me a rent abatement, I'm not going to make it. I'm probably not going to make it anyway, they're saying to their landlord. Now, that's a mistake because the landlord may only be able to help some of their tenants. And so the landlord is going to sort of look at their tenants and say, well, this guy's probably going to make it. I'll help him. But if this restaurant tenant is already telling me that they're not going to make it, they were 2 or 3 months behind in their rent before this happened. They've had a bad rent payment history. Why bother helping? Why resuscitate this tenant? They're not going to make it anyway, based on what they're telling me. So that's an important distinction to make. Now, go ahead. Can you repeat that question now? Because I want to address it specifically.
Yes, absolutely. Worst case scenario occurs and we have to close our business. What steps should we address to limit liability?
Okay, so in most cases, an LLC or some corporation is the tenant entity. All right. John Smith is not usually the tenant. It's Smith LLC. So that corporation is responsible for the lease agreement. But unfortunately, so many tenants get talked into giving personal guarantees that they have to manage that aspect of it. A personal guarantee, it's surprising how many tenants don't really comprehend this. And my kind of take on this is a personal guarantee is a lot like co-signing a loan for someone. Personally, you were saying if my company doesn't pay the rent, then John Smith will pay the rent. And that's not a good scenario to be in. I was talking to a tenant in California, and he said, well, we've got a personal guarantee, so we're just going to pay the personal guarantee, close the doors, shutter it up, and walk away. Take our equipment and walk away. And I said, well, hold on, look at the bowels of your lease agreement. You don't have the unilateral right just to pay off your personal guarantee and walk away, or forfeit your deposit and walk away. Your company is still there. Who owns the equipment? You or your company? Well, the company owns the equipment. Well, the landlord still has the right to sue the company. Okay, so whenever I get a tenant out of a lease agreement, it's through thoughtful negotiation. You want to be able to remove your equipment, but if you're in rent arrears, the landlord might be thinking, well, I'll threaten you with changing your locks. I'll be threatening you with an eviction. The reason that most tenants right now, Patricia, are not at risk of having their locks changed or being evicted from their space is that the landlord doesn't want their space back. The landlord doesn't have any other tenants that want their space. So for the most part, landlords are going to let you ride. I'll let you in on a little something that most people don't know. One of the shopping malls I used to manage back in the 80s or 90s, about 85 tenants in the mall. At any given time, there was at least 10 or 15 tenants that were 1, 2, or 3 months in arrears. So a lot of the listeners here have been good tenants. They've paid their rent on time, or they've been pretty good tenants. They paid pretty close to the rent date. But there's a lot of restaurant tenants who are way behind in rent, and they haven't paid the CAM, or they haven't paid their portion of the taxes. And so you've got to look at your situation individually, and once again, communicate with them. If you're in rent arrears right now, and you say to your landlord, I think I might either give me a rent reduction or I'm just going to go bankrupt, the landlord would then be motivated to change your locks. And I'll tell you why. If you declare bankruptcy, the landlord may lose possession of that space for several months during the legal process. Okay, well, your assets are divvied up and so on. If the landlord can kick you out or get the space back before you declare bankruptcy, he can go out and try looking for another tenant right away. So there are some subtle do's and don'ts when it comes to that process.
Great, thank you very much. The next question, actually, this leads in nicely because we do have people on the phone from all over the country. are restaurant tenants in different regions facing the same landlord challenges?
Yes, we are all in the same pandemic boat. The only difference is, Patricia, we're in it at different times. In other words, some states, the restaurants have been forced to be closed. Other states, some restaurants are still open. So everybody at some point in time is going to go through the entire process of closing and then reopening. It's just happening at different times. Where I'm seeing the most difference, though, is not from state to state or city to city, but the size of the restaurant, okay? The bigger the restaurant, the harder it is to keep it afloat without any income. And so the tenant who's paying $25,000 a month in rent is facing just such a much larger challenge that they don't have enough personal savings to necessarily bail them out the way a smaller tenant paying $4,000 or $5,000 a month in rent can. But yeah, we're going through exactly the same thing. It's just going to be over a 3-month period.
Dale, actually, before we go to our last top 10, I have a couple of other questions, but can you explain CAM?
Yes, the common area maintenance fees. So
yes.
There's 2 types of leases. There's 2 types. There's a gross lease, and on a gross lease, you pay the same amount per month pretty much no matter what. Then there's a triple net lease. And with a triple net lease, you are paying your proportionate share of all the costs to run the building. So if you occupy 7% of a plaza, you're paying for 7% of lawn cutting, 7% of snow removal, 7% of property taxes. You're paying your proportionate share. Now, even though gross leases sound better, they aren't. And 95% of all commercial restaurant leases are triple net. So most of the tenants listening to this program right now are paying a base rent. They're paying $15 or $20 or $30 per square foot. But on top of that, they're paying their common area maintenance fees. So when a landlord is talking to you right now and they're saying, well, we'll knock 50% off the rent, they probably mean 50% off the base rent. They probably expect you to pay all of the CAM. Okay, and you're, well, that isn't what you said on the phone. And the landlord's thinking, well, I didn't say, we were cutting the CAM in half. That's why when it comes down to the documentation, it's really, really critical that you know what you're agreeing to. Misunderstandings are just so common, and landlords are so they talk in this jargon and all the time. So when they say base rent, they mean base rent. When they say CAM, they mean CAM. They don't necessarily mean it all together. So this is something you want to address with the landlord, and ideally you don't want to pay any CAM at all. Like, so you want an abatement of your base rent, you want an abatement of the CAM, but they are 2 different things. Remember, the landlord gets to keep the base rent to pay their mortgage and use that money. The CAM is what runs the building and pays the taxes. So the landlord is not completely out to lunch by saying, well, I've got to have the CAM. You've got to pay your share to run the building, but it's all a negotiation.
Hey, thank you. Before we get to the last question, we have a couple more questions here I was going to touch upon or ask you. The first one here, they are in an office building which is open, but their cafe is dependent on the workers who work for these tenants of the office building. The workers are not coming in right now, and I feel after the restrictions are over, I will still be suffering and may need even more help with rent. How should I handle?
Yes, and this scenario is not uncommon. The way that I would handle this if I was helping you is I would say, okay, so for March of 2019, what were your sales? And you might say, well, $35,000 a month in March of 2019. What were your sales in March this year? Well, $4,000, right? Because just because you're open, a lot of people like my wife still won't go there. She wants to self-isolate. She wants to socially distance herself. So by using the numbers, by going back to what your sales were before, talk to the landlord on that level. too often the tenant, it's so emotional for them and it's so personal. They assume the landlord knows what the tenant is going through. Well, they know you're going through the pandemic, but they really don't know whether your bank account was on zero before the pandemic hit, or if you've got enough cash in the bank to last you for 6 months to weather the storm. They don't know that, so you've got to talk to them about about rent. Some tenants are saying, well, can I offer the landlord a percentage of my sales? Well, you can, but most of them won't take it. Partly because it's such a cash-driven business. A lot of times you're making the sale, and it's a cash transaction. The landlord can't track it, but if you're not doing any business, what does it matter if you offer the landlord 20% of your sales and 20% of zero is still zero, right? So the landlord understands percentage rent is not the direction they want this to go in.
Thank you. The next one is with Cheesecake Factory. Cheesecake Factory unilaterally stated they're not paying rent in any of their units on April 1st. On the other hand, Chapman says they're expecting full rent from all tenants. Where's the middle ground? Is the tenant fully obligated to pay under the current circumstances?
Well, I believe they're both correct. I believe that the Cheesecake Factory will not pay their rent, but that doesn't mean the landlord won't be able to force them in a court of law to come up with that money later on. Like, not paying your rent doesn't mean you don't still owe it, right? So I wouldn't use that as kind of the case in point. Remember, there's a difference between a franchise system and a chain restaurant. A chain restaurant, are we talking about Starbucks, a chain coffee shop? They don't have 2,000 franchisees out there, all with different financial situations. It's one big corporation. So landlords are going to deal with the chains in a whole different way. Now, speaking to this, I couldn't imagine some of these shopping malls not having that big Cheesecake Factory in the mall. We all go there. It's practically an anchor food tenant for that mall. So the malls don't want to lose Cheesecake Factory because they frankly don't have anybody to replace them with. It's that simple. I find it kind of curious that this announcement by the Cheesecake Factory sort of got released to the public, because I don't think it did Cheesecake Factory any good to tell that to the public. I don't know how it got released. I don't even know if it's true. We're all just, this is what we're hearing, right?
Thank you. Another good question here. Should I hire my lawyer to handle this for me so I don't make a mistake?
Well, you certainly could, but keep in mind, lawyers and attorneys are not necessarily the best tool in the toolbox. Okay, an attorney or a lawyer may write letters. They may make a good case for you on paper, but I don't find too many attorneys who are willing to call up the property manager and talk to them for 40 minutes if that's what it takes. I don't see any lawyers flying across the country to meet with a landlord to negotiate with them face to face. So be careful who you're getting to help you. Obviously you would not turn to a real estate agent. They're more of a commission-driven salesperson. And I tell tenants, if you're going to sue your landlord, then obviously you're going to need a lawyer. But if you're going to negotiate with your landlord, you might want somebody that's more like a lease consultant, somebody like myself. That's how I make my living. I'm a professional negotiator, and I call myself a consultant and a negotiator because if you're just being a good negotiator is not enough if you don't have a good strategy. So I also think that a lot of attorneys and lawyers are not going to want to take tenants. If you've had a relationship with an attorney for a long time, he might service you because you've used him over the years. But if you call up an attorney now and you say, will you help me approach my landlord? Yeah. The first thing they're going to do is say, well, send me a $3,000 retainer and then see where it goes from there. And they may not give you the service that you want. So I have nothing against attorneys. I just don't think you want to take a knife to a gunfight.
Thanks, Dale. And actually that leads nicely into our question here that's on the screen. If you can talk a little bit about what your services of the Lease Coach offers, what yours are, if you negotiate a rent assistance package for a restaurant tenant, and kind of what happens next in the process.
well over 20 years ago, when I formed the Lease Coach, I wanted to create a menu of my services, a menu with all the fees and projects that we offer. And so, if a tenant reaches out to us, I can send you my rate sheet. We have project packages for tenants who want us to negotiate their lease renewal, tenants who want us to do their site selection, tenants who want us to do their document reviews. We have a coaching package. Everything's based on a project scope and a project fee. But because of recent situations with the pandemic, we've introduced a $1,500 rent assistance project package. So a restaurant owner can reach out to us, and some of these restaurant owners, Patricia, they want to communicate with the landlord. They have a relationship with the landlord. They want to keep that relationship. And so I'm coaching them through the process. I'm showing them what to do. Others are turning to us and saying, Dale, here's your $1,500. I want you to take charge. I want you to contact my landlord or my property manager and handle this for me. And that will typically last 45 to 60 days as we settle everything out and we get a document from the landlord. I had a situation in California recently where my client had several large restaurants. He was paying about $20,000 a month in one of his restaurants. And he said, Dale, I don't want this restaurant anymore. I've been here for 18 years, but I know the landlord. It's a freestanding building. This is what he said. He said, I'm going to approach the landlord, and this is how I'm going to pitch the landlord. And I'm going to see if I can break my lease. And I'm going to offer him this and this and this. And I said, no, I don't think that strategy is going to work. I said, first of all, this is the strategy I want you to take. And second of all, this is a document, a lease termination document that I want you to present him with, okay? Because even if you agree to something verbally, it doesn't mean you're going to get it in writing. He called me back about 3 days later and he said, I sat down with the landlord for an hour. I followed your script. I said exactly what you told me to say. At the right point, I pulled out the lease termination document, and be damned if I didn't walk out of there. He signed it. He signed it and I walked out of there with it. He said, I didn't have to pay him a penny. I didn't have to do anything. I walked away, and he said, I got rid of that expense. So the ability, like some of the listeners here are hoping to come out the other end of this. They're hoping to come out the other end with a rent reduction and survive. Others aren't going to be that fortunate, but they've got personal guarantees on their lease, Patricia. And if they don't manage this properly, it's going to cost them hundreds of thousands of dollars personally because they didn't take the right approach. So it helps that I've done over 1,500 projects over 27 years. I'm a pretty average guy. I'm an average husband. I'm an average dad. I'm an average golfer. But at this, being the lease coach and negotiating leases, this is my passion career. This is what I was meant to do. And it's always fun and it's always exciting. And that's when they say, if you're having fun, you don't even know you're working.
Those are definitely great words. I love that. And we have a pretty interesting question here that had come in. This is, we have not started construction yet and anticipate that we could open in 3 months from the start. We would like to open in 6 months. What can we say to the landlord to approve a delayed opening?
Well, we would negotiate a lease amending agreement. And the critical clause that we would be negotiating is the tenant's ability to freeze the deal, to pause the deal until the pandemic was lifted, until they were comfortable opening. Because as long as the tenant is willing to go forward and build it, you just don't, it's going to feel pretty bad to be paying rent 3 months from now if you can't open or there's no one to come to your restaurant. So this is a doable scenario. I've had a lot of tenants reaching out to me saying, I signed a lease a year ago. The landlord now has the mall built. Now they're going to give me my keys next week. Do I have to take the keys? Things like that. Tenants don't want to take possession of the space. So it's negotiable. I think in this particular instance, the landlord is probably going to be quite receptive if your approach is a little bit more like, this is what we're telling you is going to happen. I never negotiated arrogantly, but I can be assertive. I can be aggressive. Sometimes if you can't pay your rent, sometimes you're better to ask for forgiveness that you didn't pay your rent than to ask for permission that you wouldn't have to pay your rent. Okay, these are wild times. I've had clients come to me that said, I can only afford to pay half my rent. And so I say, okay, do you have a spare set of keys? And they say, yeah, here's a spare set of keys to my business. I say, write me a half rent check made payable to the landlord. And I walk those two things down to the property manager's office, and very genuinely, very respectfully, with no arrogance, almost in an apologetic tone, I'll say to the property manager, I'm sorry that I'm here today. I've got good news and bad news. The bad news is we can't pay all the rent. The good news is we can pay half the rent. And so which one of these would you like? And I hold up my hands and I say, would you like half the rent, or would you like the keys back to the restaurant? And they've never taken the keys. They always take the half rent, okay? Because they really, for the most part, don't want your space back.
I'm definitely learning a lot today, so I appreciate all of your expertise on this subject matter. We just had another question come in. I was planning to list my restaurant for sale before the pandemic. How long do you think it will be before the economy will normalize?
I think it'll be at least a year before you have any true hope of being able to find a buyer for your restaurant. I think it's going to be, at least that amount of time. And, the sort of the plus side to this on a renewal, some of these tenants are, Patricia, some of these tenants are in their renewal period right now, right? Not only are they facing a rent assistance negotiation, but their lease is expiring in 7 months. What the pandemic is doing is the pandemic is going to modify or shift or reduce what's called the market rent. And so consequently, you may actually lose the battle of the pandemic. You lost all that income you're not going to ever get back. But if you were paying $30 per square foot and now we renew you at $22 per square foot, your timing on the renewal was very good. In other words, if your lease is coming up for renewal and you plan to keep your business open, this should be your opportunity to lock it in at a much lower rental rate. So there is some good news on that side of it. But if you're trying to sell your restaurant now, it's going to be a year wait.
Wow, thank you very much. I don't think we've had any more questions coming in. So Dale, I wanted to see if there was any final information that you wanted to share. Anything that we didn't touch upon that would be important for people to know. And also if you wanted to just, mention how everyone can get in touch with you. I know we have this slide up as well.
That's right. Of course, you can go to our website, theleasecoach.com. My email address is there. It's on your screen, Dale Willerton at theleasecoach.com. This is what I want you to reach out to me for, okay? This is my third book, Negotiating Commercial Leases and Renewals for Dummies. You can get this in Barnes & Noble. You can get it on Amazon. But if you email me, if you book a consult, a free 20 or 30-minute consult, and you want to talk about your situation, I'm going to autograph a copy of this. Patricia, when I speak at the restaurant shows in California, New York, Florida, I'm giving these away by the hundreds. And I was talking to a tenant today, and he said he was on page 95, and he was reading it from front to back. And I said, this book is not meant to be read front to back. It's written in sections. You can read the deposit section, the personal guarantee section. You can read the percentage rent section. You can read whatever you need. So if you don't have a copy of this, this is very important information you're going to want to get your hands on. So reach out to me, book a consult. Give me a little, because we're having quite a surge of inquiries now. Be patient. I'll respond. We'll book something and try to talk to you. And when you email me, don't just say, this is John Smith, I own a restaurant, call me. Tell me your backstory. Give me a little bit of information, because that helps me sort of get my mind around it when I do give you a phone call. And typically it will be myself, or, I've got a business partner, Jeff Granfield. He's co-author of this book. He might have to get back to you, but we'll try to handle all the incoming calls. And I want to remind listeners, in leasing, restaurant tenants don't get what they deserve. They get what they negotiate. So keep that in mind.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dale. I also want to just leave everyone with a couple of words here. First, I just wanted to thank you for a terrific presentation. I know that I certainly learned a lot. I hope everyone else did who attended this webinar today. So thank you for sharing your expertise with our audience. As we receive content and information from industry experts, partners, associations, and more, our team is continuously updating our industry resource page at foodandbevshows.com in order to help everyone stay educated and connected with this rapidly changing environment. So I hope everyone tunes into these pages. We do appreciate your continued support of the Clarion Events Food and Beverage Group. And I do hope that everyone is staying healthy and safe during this difficult time. We do have more webinars planned. You can see it on the slide that we have up. Those were some previous webinars and some upcoming webinars. These will be made available on our website, as well as Dale's webinar today will be sent out via email to everyone, so you will get a copy of the recording. And this will also be available on our website in the coming week. So again, thank you everyone for joining. Have a great afternoon and stay safe. Thank you.